let's start with something that was a big surprise to me because I turned 18 just in Reagan's second election and missed by voting against him by 3 weeks. And what really surprised me about your book was learning that he was as religious as he was. I had no idea, and that was certainly not the way that he was portrayed at the time, as far as I can remember, at least in the communication that I received. I feel like other people were receiving different communication about him, but he wasn't. We talk about that for a moment.
Well, Sam, I think you were receiving the communication most people were, because the media saw Reagan's religiosity as basically a ploy to win voters. They said he never went to church, he didn't show any signs of religiosity. So reporters tended to think of him as opportunistically religious. However, if you go into the records and the history, you will see that he had a very long-standing connection to Christianity. When he was growing up, many of his friends thought he would become a minister because he was so engaged in his church. And after he left the presidency, there was a letter that reporter Karen Tumulty found in Nancy Reagan's possession that Reagan had written to her father when he was on his deathbed, when her father was on his deathbed. And basically Reagan said, I know you've been an atheist all your life, but if you don't embrace Jesus, you will be in hell forever. I will not see you again. Please, please reconsider. Please become a follower of Jesus. That's not verbatim, but that's what the letter said.
And we should just be clear. The letter wasn't written after his presidency. The letter was found after his presidency.
I think the letter was written after his presidency, but it was found after his presidency.
Okay.
And that's a pretty clear indication of someone's religiosity.
Yes, I would imagine. And I understand the sort of like, I mean, he was at least twice divorced, I think it was, and he was from Hollywood at least at one point. And so there's this sort of perception that he wouldn't be religious. But how did his message of religiosity get to the right ears, I guess is the question.
Well, he was a hard sell to some conservative evangelicals because, as you say, he was divorced. He was from Hollywood. And most of all, he had been president of a union. He'd been president of the Screen Actors Guild. And he was a pretty good Democrat until that time. So he had a lot of convincing to do. He began that when he ran for governor of California, and he began to talk about his evangelical bona fides. He went to a very conservative church in LA, and a lot of those folks began letting it be known that he was born again, he was saved, and that he would be a good Christian politician.
What was the? Talk about Jerry Falwell and the moral majority, which had really started to gain steam, I guess, in the years in which he was in California as governor, and even in his first run for the presidency. They were like, how did that relationship develop there? Like, I mean, if the media was out there with this notion of Reagan as not a religious person, that he was, more sort of like coastal in his sensibility, how did the message get communicated? Because I'm comparing it to like Donald Trump, who's also a coastal figure, who also multiple divorced, also does not appear to be religious. I also happen to think he's not. Yeah. But Mike Pence ended up being the vehicle for bringing along those people, when needed. For George W. Bush, he was a self-proclaimed reborn, and they used marriage equality to establish his bona fides. How did Reagan do this in a way that reached the evangelicals who were only then around that era, at least, in the late 70s, starting to enter into the sort of like what had been prior left to Caesar was no longer only Caesar's purview.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Sam. Most people don't know it, but Jerry Falwell also had a church in Orange County, California, and he had known Reagan for a while. Falwell initially was not supportive of Reagan when Reagan was governor because Reagan did not clamp down on abortion like Falwell had hoped. But subsequently, Reagan began becoming more outspoken about his conservative evangelical policies. He was a strong law and order governor. He cut back welfare here in California. And I think that after the debacle of Barry Goldwater in '64, Republicans knew they needed to put a friendly face on their conservative policies. And Reagan began barnstorming the country, talking to a lot of groups through his General Electric connections, going to churches, and he managed to convince evangelicals. One of the big turning points was when he spoke in Dallas to a large crowd of Southern Baptists and other evangelicals and said, I support you. I'm your guy. And his sincerity got through to them. And at that point, they were so desperate to get someone in there to repeal Roe versus Wade and to return prayer in school that they were willing to go with what might have been an unusual candidate at a prior time.
You write about how the media sort of both ignored or put a more benign face to the extent that or maybe even ignored Reagan's personal religiosity, but ended up like creating a narrative that was imbued with this religiosity. Can you talk about that and tell us what religious imaginary means?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, but the media is an important part of the story. And I sometimes think I have trouble getting that across because the media is still the vehicle to tell the story. A friend who was a reporter at Time magazine when Reagan was running the first time said that Henry Grunwald, who was ahead of Time then, told the staff, "We've already killed 3 presidents. I don't want to do a 4th." In other words, he was very well aware of the fact that Carter, Ford, and Nixon had all been slammed in the media, and the media bore responsibility for all their falls. And he didn't think doing that to Reagan was a smart idea. So that, to me, is key in terms of how the media covered him, because at that point in time, we did not have the many outlets we have today, and media followed each other. So if Time was doing something, you could pretty well be sure that Newsweek and New York Times and Washington Post were doing it all. Reagan seemed to many of them like a sweet older man, genial, cowboy type. They weren't going to go after him in the same way that they had gone after his predecessors. That's number one. Now,
and can I just add, just so for the context for people who are watching the program, who are all younger than me, Time magazine was the pinnacle. I mean, the New York Times were certainly up there too, but Time magazine, we have no analog in today's media landscape to what Time magazine and Newsweek was. Newsweek was sort of like like following, almost like comedically following Time, but it was also quite big. I mean, Newsweek was big, but Time was it. It was the center of the news media. And this is in an era when we had 3 news stations that were at 6 p.m. every night, and that was it for an hour, half hour, depending on what it was. And then the New York Times, and that was basically it. That's where 95% of the population got its news.
Exactly so. And if the head of that organization was basically telling his reporters, go soft on Reagan because we don't want to be responsible for the fourth president's decline. That is a major deal. That you're exactly right, Sam. It's hard to understand today because there's not the same kind of media monopoly and media gateposts. And as I said, Reagan was depicted by the media as this genial older man who smiled a lot and made gaffes. And they had stories about him that, they would tell, but they really didn't understand what was going on underneath, which was this, as you say, conservative turn that he was perpetuating in his rhetoric, which the media itself picked up. So if he said something like the Soviet Union is an evil empire, which was something he said in a speech in March 1983 to the National Association of Evangelicals, most reporters didn't really talk about that because they thought it was like really weird and stupid, and they didn't know how to put it into a news article, like who calls the Soviet Union an evil empire. But his evangelical conservative followers totally got what he was saying. He was saying that we are in a cosmic struggle with communism. Communism is our ultimate enemy. And we as Christians need to fight a system that's anti-God, anti-capitalism, and anti-democracy. And to some extent, that is how the message got to evangelicals, because they had ears to hear what secular people might not have.
I want to just add too, about the first point about Reagan getting treated with kid gloves. They called him Teflon Ron at that time, exactly. Where nothing would stick to Ronald Reagan, but nothing would stick to Ronald Reagan. What became a self-fulfilling prophecy. And there was no attempts to make anything stick to Reagan. And also, it's also amazing to hear the idea that calling the Soviet Union an evil empire was so anachronistic then, because the idea of calling our enemies evil now is almost like no one doesn't do that. Right. Like at the time, people have to understand that things had secularized in civil society in such a way that good, evil, no, there may be our enemy, they may be, but you don't use that religious language to describe these things any more than you would, I don't know, some weird sports metaphor or something.
Exactly. And that's why the phrase was not quoted in most articles, in most television broadcasts, until, if at all, the very end of the piece, where, they kind of threw it in.